Chicago, 1921. A city straining at the seams, pulsing with jazz clubs, illicit liquor, and the constant clash between wealth and poverty. The skyline, newly punctured by steel towers, cast long shadows over cobblestone alleys, where bootleggers and dreamers crossed paths under the same pale moonlight. It was a time when fortunes were made overnight, and lives could vanish just as quickly. Against this backdrop of restless ambition and creeping danger, the story of Margaret Whitmore begins. A story that would slip from society's gossip into the realm of legend, a disappearance that no detective, no priest, and no clairvoyant could ever explain. Margaret was not just another young woman of Chicago's elite. She was an heiress, daughter of industrial wealth, raised in a mansion overlooking Lake Michigan, her life supposedly secured by privilege. Yet on a chilly December evening, she walked through the gilded doors of her family's estate and was never seen again. No body was found. No ransom was demanded. No letter of explanation arrived in the post. Only silence followed, an absence so profound it became louder than any scream. For the Whitmore family, silence was the chosen response. For the city of Chicago, silence became the seed of rumor, speculation, and fear. In the first frantic days, police scrambled. Detectives interviewed servants, tracked chauffeurs, and examined gala guest lists. Yet every trail they pursued collapsed into contradiction. Witnesses disagreed. Timelines clashed. Evidence evaporated. It was as if the city itself conspired to erase her. Hired investigators from outside Chicago fared no better. They claimed obstruction, missing files, bribed officers. And so when logic faltered, the void was filled with imagination. Psychics claimed to hear her voice in seance halls. Priests whispered of sins in the family's past that demanded penance. Neighbors spoke of lights flickering in the heiress's room long after she was gone. Some believed she eloped to escape her gilded cage. Others swore Chicago's underworld had claimed her. A few whispered that her disappearance was not earthly at all, that Margaret was payment for a debt reaching far beyond the material. What makes this case endure is not the crime itself, but the way it defies resolution. In every disappearance there is usually a trace, a clue, a pattern, a confession decades later. Yet Margaret Whitmore became an echo, her absence filled by myth, her name carried like a ghost through Chicago's alleys, parlors, and pulp newspapers. Her story sits uneasily at the crossroads of fact and folklore, innocence and evil, reason and superstition. Tonight, we do not promise you an answer. We cannot. What we offer instead is the descent into a riddle that consumed detectives, confounded families, and still lingers a century later. Perhaps the truth died with her. Or perhaps it walks among us still, waiting to be recognized in the shadows of a city that has never stopped whispering her name. Chicago, at the turn of the 20th century, was a city reborn from ashes. Less than 50 years had passed since the Great Fire of 1871, yet already its streets roared with the energy of commerce and ambition. Steel mills thundered, railroads shrieked their presence, and wealth bloomed in stone mansions along Lakeshore Drive. Among these palatial homes, wrapped in manicured gardens and guarded by wrought iron gates, one in particular stood taller, grander, and more imposing: the Whitmore estate. It was here in 1901 that Margaret Elise Whitmore entered the world, a child born into a dynasty of fortune and expectation. Her father, Jonathan Whitmore, had built his empire in steel, supplying the girders that pushed Chicago's skyline into the clouds. Her mother, Evelyn, was the daughter of an old banking family, a woman of porcelain beauty and rigid etiquette. To the outside world, the Whitmores represented the pinnacle of American success: wealth without limits, a family untouched by want, and a daughter who seemed destined to inherit both privilege and prominence. Yet behind closed doors, luxury often reveals its own form of confinement. From an early age, Margaret's life followed a script. Private tutors taught her French, Latin, and piano in the gilded drawing rooms of the estate. Riding lessons began before dawn at a private stable. Social appearances were carefully arranged: luncheons with other daughters of fortune, rehearsed pleasantries at society teas, and the constant pressure to smile, to dazzle, to embody the perfection her family's status demanded. In photographs published in the Chicago Tribune, she appears radiant, a young woman whose life sparkled like the lights along Michigan Avenue. Yet the reality, pieced together decades later from her surviving letters and diary fragments, tells another story, one of suffocation, doubt, and quiet despair. "I feel like a bird in a cage," one entry reads, dated April 1919. "The walls sere golden, the floor polished, the air perfumed with roses. But still, it is a cage. I cannot choose my friends. I cannot choose my fate. Even the air I breathe feels borrowed." To historians, this confession paints the portrait of a young woman imprisoned by her privilege. To her contemporaries, it was scandalous, if it were ever truly hers. Some argue the diaries were fabricated, perhaps planted to shape the narrative of her disappearance. After all, a runaway heiress sounds more believable, even sympathetic, if her words foreshadow escape. But if the writings were genuine, they reveal a striking truth: that wealth can suffocate as easily as poverty, only in silence and velvet. Society papers adored her. At 17, she was described as the pearl of Chicago's Lake Shorelight. At 19, her photograph was circulated in magazines showcasing debutantes. Suitors courted her not only for her beauty, but for the name and fortune she carried. Some whispered she might marry into European nobility, aligning American steel with fading aristocracy. Yet Margaret seemed reluctant. Letters to her cousin in New York describe suitors as parading peacocks, and speak of her dread at being bartered like a jewel to be displayed. These confessions suggest that Margaret, far from basking in adoration, felt hunted by expectation. Still, appearances had to be maintained. She attended galas, posed for portraits, and smiled through introductions. The Whitmores prided themselves on control of industry, of reputation, of their daughter's future. Yet, as history has shown, repression often breeds rebellion. Beneath the silk gowns and glittering chandeliers, Margaret's cage began to crack. The contrast between her public and private image became most evident in 1920. That summer, Prohibition raged, speakeasies flourished, and Chicago descended into a dance of crime and excess. Rumors surfaced in the underground press, whispers that Margaret had been seen slipping into clubs in the company of men far outside her social station: jazz, musicians, writers, even figures tied to the bootlegging trade. These accounts, largely unverified, were dismissed by polite society. Yet they persisted, repeated in whispers at gatherings, printed in columns of lesser newspapers hungry for scandal. Was she, as the Chicago Tribune insisted, a fragile flower, sheltered from corruption? Or was she, as underground reporters hinted, already entangled in the city's darker veins? Historians remain divided. Some argue the rumors were smears, attempts to tarnish a family whose fortune attracted envy. Others believe they carried truth, pointing to her desire for freedom and the diary entries that spoke of suffocation. If Margaret longed to escape her gilded cage, what better rebellion than to step into the world her family despised? To dance, where smoke and jazz blurred respectability, to taste a life forbidden. The possibility lingers, tantalizing and damning in equal measure. And yet, another theory persists, that Margaret was not the author of her escape, but the victim of a larger game. Her family's wealth was not without enemies. Steel fortunes clashed with unions, with rivals, with Chicago's growing criminal syndicates who saw in every heiress a potential ransom. To those who interpret her disappearance through this lens, Margaret was not a bird who fled, but a lamb led to slaughter, targeted because of her name, her father's fortune, and the vulnerability that comes with innocence. It is here that the contrast sharpens. Was Margaret an agent of her fate, rebelling against her family's cage? Or was she an unwilling pawn, sacrificed to debts, rivalries, or the hunger of the underworld? The truth may be a mixture of both, but neither possibility offers comfort. Adding fuel to the speculation were the diaries themselves. After her disappearance, fragments were leaked to the press. Some passages were romantic, longing for escape. Others hinted at fear, describing shadows outside her window, and the sense of being watched. One chilling line reads, "I feel the walls there closing in. Whether they keep be safe or trap me, I do not know." These writings became evidence for both camps, proof of her yearning for freedom, and proof that she sensed danger long before the night she vanished. But even the diaries are suspect. Some scholars argue they were altered, even forged, to serve one narrative or another. If so, by whom? By the Whitmores to excuse a runaway daughter? By opportunistic journalists to sell papers? Or by someone closer? Someone who wanted to twist her memory, to make her vanish not just in body but in truth. The authenticity of her voice remains debated, like an echo distorted by distance. Beyond the written word, her life was also recorded, in the memories of those who knew her. Servants remembered her askance but withdrawn, often standing at windows staring toward the lake. Friends described her as charming in company, but restless in private. One recalled her saying, "I feel like a ghost in my own home." Another swore Margaret once confided that she wished to disappear, to see if anyone would truly search for her, or if they would simply replace her with silence. Whether these recollections are truth or retrospective invention, they feed the haunting portrait of a young woman at war with her gilded world. The press, of course, shaped her into whatever figure best sold copies. The Chicago Tribune painted her as fragile, innocent, a victim of forces beyond her control. Tabloid writers and underground papers painted her as a restless rebel, perhaps even reckless, dabbling in affairs and debts that placed her in peril. To the public, she was both saint and sinner, captive and conspirator, victim and architect. The contradictions blurred her identity, leaving behind not Margaret the person, but Margaret the symbol. And so, when she vanished on that December evening, in 1921, the narrative was already written. The fragile heiress, the rebellious daughter, the lamb led to slaughter. Whichever image one chose, her disappearance seemed inevitable. She had been cast in a story long before she disappeared, and all that remained was the haunting silence that followed. The gilded cage, then, is more than metaphor. It was the mansion that kept her enclosed, the family that bound her future, the wealth that both protected and endangered her. It was also the narrative cage, the one built by newspapers, by rumor, by history itself. Whether Margaret sought to break free or was consumed within it, the cage defined her life, and perhaps her death. This foundation matters, because the moment we step into the night of her disappearance, we must ask, did she open the cage door herself, stepping into the darkness of her own accord? Or did unseen hands pry it open, dragging her into a fate she never chose? Either way, Margaret Whitmore's story begins not with her vanishing, but with her confinement, and it is here, in the glittering shadows of wealth and silence, that the mystery truly takes root. December 3rd, 1921. Chicago was deep in the grip of winter, its streets lined with frost, its lakefront shrouded in mist. The city that roared with jazz and bootleg liquor by night seemed unusually hushed, as though holding its breath. On this evening, the Whitmores' only daughter stepped out into society once more, attending what would be her last public appearance, a glittering gala at the Drake Hotel. The event was one of the season's highlights. Music swelling from the grand ballroom, pearls glinting under chandeliers, the mingling of Chicago's wealthiest families in a haze of champagne and perfume. Margaret Whitmore arrived as expected, escorted by her parents and trailed by whispers. She was 20 years old, poised on the precipice between youth and maturity, caught between the image her family projected and the private doubts she harbored. Guests later recalled her entrance in vivid but contradictory detail. Some remembered her as radiant, smiling faintly as though savoring the attention. Others recalled her subdued, pale, her eyes darting toward shadows rather than faces. Already, before she had even vanished, Margaret existed in two versions at once: the glittering heiress and the restless ghost in waiting. The gala unfolded. In typical fashion, dances, polite laughter, exchanges of gossip carried like contraband between champagne glasses. Margaret danced only twice, once with a young banker's son, once with an older family friend. After that, she withdrew to the edges of the ballroom, speaking little, smiling less. A friend swore she overheard Margaret whispering, "I don't want to be here." Though whether this was a momentary fatigue or something darker remains unclear. Later that night, she was seen leaving the Drake around midnight, stepping into a sleek black motorcar driven by the family's chauffeur. It was the last sighting upon which everyone could agree. From here, the story fractures. Witnesses disagree in maddening detail. One guest swore Margaret turned to wave from the car window, her expression calm, even cheerful. Another insisted she looked tense, her hand gripping the frame as though she feared what lay ahead. The chauffeur's account proved no anchor. In one statement, he claimed he drove her directly home. In another, he confessed she asked Toby taken elsewhere, though he refused to specify where. By the time investigators pressed him harder, his testimony had shifted so many times that nothing remained reliable. Whether from fear, bribery, or guilt, the driver's truth dissolved into silence. Police traced the motorcar as far as an alley, near Rush Street, where the chauffeur claimed he stopped briefly. Some suggested Margaret stepped out there, disappearing into the maze of city blocks. Others argued the stop was a fabrication, a lie constructed to obscure a more sinister handoff. Residents nearby reported nothing unusual, though one night watchman swore he saw a young woman matching Margaret's description enter another waiting car. When questioned again days later, he retracted his statement entirely. Why? Pressure from the police, threats from the underworld, or his own fragile memory? The uncertainty thickened with every word spoken. Official reports became riddled with contradictions. Some files suggested evidence of a struggle inside the motor car, scuff marks on the leather, a torn fragment of lace. Others omitted these details entirely. Rumors spread of bribed officers, records deliberately altered or destroyed. Detectives who pursued the truth too aggressively found themselves reassigned or silenced. In the machinery of 1920s Chicago, where law and corruption shared the same desk, the disappearance of an heiress became not just a case but a game of influence. Was law enforcement incompetent, complicit, or both? As suspicion spread, neighbors near the Whitmore estate reported eerie happenings that same night. Several swore they saw strange lights flickering in the upper windows of Margaret's room, though the family insisted she had not returned home. Others claimed to hear muffled shouting from within the mansion around the hour she was last seen. Were these misperceptions fueled by gossip or fragments of hidden truth? If Margaret had returned secretly, then what fate awaited her behind those locked doors? Some suggested an accident covered up. Others whispered of darker rituals, of debts owed by wealthy families whose fortunes were not as clean as they appeared. In the weeks following her disappearance, Chicago's seance halls and backroom spiritualists found themselves overwhelmed with requests. Mediums declared they had contacted Margaret beyond the veil. One claimed to hear her whispering through the static of a crystal radio, begging for release. Another insisted her body lay beneath the frozen waters of Lake Michigan, trapped in ice until spring. Evelyn Whitmore, her mother, reportedly attended these seances in secret, clutching at hope wherever she could find it. The idea that her daughter's voice echoed through the veil spread quickly through Chicago's rumor mills, giving birth to stories where fact and folklore blurred. This was the true paradox of that December night. It was both over-documented and eerily hollow. Everyone had a story, yet no two aligned. Police files clashed with psychic visions. Servants' testimonies shifted under pressure. Witnesses contradicted one another until their words dissolved into noise. The sheer abundance of detail became its own kind of void. It was as though Margaret's vanishing created a whirlpool, pulling in facts, fictions, and fears, until no one could tell where reality ended and invention began. Some historians argue the case became unsolvable because it occurred at the crossroads of two Chicagos: the Chicago of rational progress, skyscrapers, and modern policing, and the Chicago of shadows, superstition, and unspoken debts. In one version of events, Margaret was the victim of mundane crime, kidnapped by opportunists, silenced by gangsters, hidden in the underbelly of the city. In another, her disappearance defies reason, an abduction by forces intangible, a vanishing orchestrated by destiny itself. Both versions exist side by side, each reinforced by fragments of testimony, each undone by contradictions. Take the chauffeur, again. In his final account, he claimed Margaret asked to be taken back to the mansion, but when they arrived, he saw no lights, no waiting parents. Hess swore he dropped her at the gates and drove away. Yet neighbors reported no such arrival. No car pulling up, no footsteps crunching across the icy drive. If he lied, what did he conceal? If he told the truth, why did every outside eye fail to see? The chauffeur eventually vanished from public record himself, dismissed by the Whitmores, and quietly relocated. His silence remains one of the night's most persistent shadows. Even stranger was the rumor of a letter, one allegedly intercepted by police but never released. Some journalists claimed it was a confession, written in Margaret's own hand, declaring her intent to escape. Others insisted it was a ransom demand, proof she had been taken. No such document has ever surfaced. Was it suppressed by the family to control the narrative? Or did it never exist, born only of a reporter's invention to sell more copies? The absence of the letter is as haunting as its supposed content. Every investigation returned to the same paradox. Too much, yet too little. Too many witnesses, yet no agreement. Too many theories, yet no conclusion. The city's labyrinth of alleys, tunnels, and shadows seemed to swallow Margaret whole, leaving behind only echoes. In time, the night itself became a legend. Children whispered of the heiress who waved goodbye and stepped into nothingness. Jazz musicians told tales of a pale girl haunting the Drake's ballroom, forever searching for her lost way home. To the superstitious, her vanishing was proof that Chicago was cursed, its wealth bought with blood, its fortunes shadowed by debts no money could repay. To the rationale, it was a crime without evidence, a puzzle whose pieces had been scattered deliberately. Yet the most unsettling possibility is that both are true. Perhaps Margaret was a victim of crime, but her fate became obscured by superstition. Or perhaps superstition provided the perfect cover for crime, clouding facts with visions until clarity was impossible. In this way, the night of December 3rd became more than an event. It became a mirror of the city itself, glittering on the surface, corrupted beneath, haunted in every corner. And so we return to the central riddle. Did Margaret Whitmore vanish because of human hands, or because of something darker that lingers in silence? Every account, every contradiction, points in two directions at once, toward the ordinary violence of organized crime and toward the inexplicable pull of fate. The truth of that night remains trapped between them, like Margaret herself, caught between reality and myth, between the flicker of a car's headlamps and the whisper of a ghost in seance halls. Whether she smiled and waved, or trembled in fear, whether she stepped willingly into the car or was forced, whether she returned home or disappeared into the labyrinth, these questions remain suspended, unanswered, haunting. Perhaps the real horror of December 3rd lies not in what happened, but in what refuses to be known. In the days following Margaret Whitmore's disappearance, Chicago became a stage. The city that already thrived in spectacle, the gangland shootouts, the underground clubs, the parades of prohibition wealth, now had a drama of a different kind. The vanishing of an heiress whose name carried both fortune and mystery. What should have been a straightforward police investigation quickly transformed into something stranger, larger, and more grotesque. A public tug-of-war between reason and superstition, between detectives with magnifying glasses and psychics with crystal balls. And in this conflict, truth seemed less important than performance. The Chicago Police Department was the first to respond, though their reputation was already tarnished. Corruption ran deep in the 1920s force, with officers bought and sold by bootleggers, brothels, and anyone willing to slip bills into a pocket. Detectives scoured the city, or so they claimed, but their methods leaned heavily on intimidation. Servants were dragged into interrogation rooms and pressured to confess knowledge they didn't have. Drivers, gardeners, and cooks were questioned until exhaustion. The family's chauffeur swore under oath he had last seen Margaret at the gates of the mansion, but his story shifted under pressure, as if rewritten by fear or bribery. Yet the Whitmores, untrusting of local officers, turned outward. They summoned investigators from New York, private detectives known for their modern methods. These men carried cameras, fingerprint kits, and notebooks filled with codes. They examined letters, photographed footprints, and tested locks for tampering. The contrast was stark. While Chicago officers slapped suspects and demanded answers, the New Yorkers bent over cigar ash with magnifying glasses, insisting every detail might speak. Their arrival electrified the press, who now had two narratives: to cover brute interrogation versus scientific precision. But precision also failed. No fingerprints linked to strangers. No ransom letters arrived. The chauffeur's story dissolved into fragments, but never into evidence. The trail grew colder with every passing day, and the New York detectives returned home, their reports filled with unanswered questions and vague suspicions of cover-ups. They blamed Chicago police for obstruction. Chicago police mocked them as Eastern dandies. In the absence of truth, rivalry flourished. Then came the charlatans. It began with whispers, mediums offering their services, letters arriving at the Whitmore estate from self-proclaimed visionaries. Soon, they multiplied. Spiritualists knocked at the family gates, claiming they had seen Margaret in dreams. A clairvoyant from St. Louis insisted she had channeled Margaret's voice, which begged for discovery beneath the frozen surface of Lake Michigan. A Chicago psychic, already known for hosting fashionable seances, claimed she had been visited by a young woman clothed in white silk, trembling, standing in a room without windows. Newspapers devoured these proclamations. Headlines blared, "Detectives fail, psychic sees heiress in vision." The Whitmores themselves were torn. Jonathan Whitmore, ever the man of industry, scoffed at superstition and demanded facts. Yet Evelyn, Margaret's mother, was more vulnerable to hope. Desperate for answers, she began to fund seances in secret, inviting mediums into the Whitmore mansion under cover of night. Journalists soon uncovered these clandestine gatherings, and the contrast became irresistible: cold steel logic versus trembling candlelit mysticism. The press could not resist turning the investigation into a morality play. One of the most infamous sessions took place in January 1922. A medium named Celeste Duval, French-born and famed in Chicago's spiritualist circles, claimed to summon Margaret's presence in the Whitmore dining hall. Witnesses recalled how Evelyn Whitmore fainted when Celeste's voice shifted into a younger, trembling tone, whispering, "Mama, forgive them. I am beneath the water." Days later, dredging crews dragged Lake Michigan in search of her body, only to find nothing but debris. The seance had produced nothing but spectacle. Yet to the grieving mother, the experience felt real, and that was enough to keep her faith alive. The detectives bristled. They condemned the seances as distractions, exploiting grief and wasting time, but they too failed to produce results. One detective, a grizzled veteran named Harold Dunn, insisted Margaret had been kidnapped by a smuggling ring. He traced connections between Whitmore steel shipments and gangs moving alcohol across state lines. She was leverage, Dunn argued, a pawn in a bigger game. Yet this investigation collapsed when every supposed lead ended in silence. Dunn himself grew paranoid, claiming evidence was being destroyed, witnesses silenced. He told colleagues, it was as if the city wanted Margaret gone, not just physically but erased from memory. This strange vacuum, the absence of evidence, the contradictions of testimony, fed into the city's appetite for myth. Citizens debated in bars and barber shops. Was she drowned in the lake, buried in the stockyards, hidden in plain sight in some convent, or spirited away by forces beyond comprehension? The case had ceased to be about Margaret herself. It had become a reflection of Chicago's own fractured identity. Was the city ruled by crime, by reason, or by unseen shadows? Newspapers fanned the flames. Each headline leaned toward one camp or another. Whitmore heiress taken by gangsters appeared one day, society girl seen by psychic in Lake Vision the next. Competing editors mocked each other while profiting from the frenzy. Every claim became part of the archive of contradictions, every fact both affirmed and denied by another source. What of the Whitmores? They drifted between extremes. Some days they demanded scientific progress, funding laboratories to examine scraps of fabric or testing handwriting on anonymous letters. Other days they sat in candlelit rooms, clutching hands while mediums whispered ghostly words. Their grief oscillated between logic and desperation, mirroring the city's split. The Whitmores became symbols of a broader human truth. In the face of unbearable mystery, even the most rational minds cling to superstition, while even the most faithful grow desperate for proof. It is here that psychology enters the tale. Historians and criminologists later examined the case as a study in cognitive dissonance. When facts collapse, the human mind creates patterns in shadows. The detectives insisted on evidence, but twisted each failed lead into conspiracy. The spiritualists, lacking proof, transformed grief into performance. Each side sought to control the narrative, but both fed the same hunger, the need to make sense of the senseless. And in that hunger, Margaret's fate slipped further away. Yet perhaps the most haunting detail is how every promising lead ended, not in revelation, but in silence. A witness who claimed to have seen her near the train station recanted. A smuggler, who supposedly confessed to her kidnapping, vanished before trial. Letters addressed to the Whitmores hinting at ransom dissolved into hoaxes. Each thread unraveled as soon as it was pulled, as though the city itself swallowed evidence whole. Harold Dunn's words echo here. Chicago doesn't want her found. Whether this silence was born of corruption, coincidence, or something darker, it gave the case its eternal chill. Over time, every failure of the investigation became the spectacle. Detectives and psychics alike paraded before the press, their reputations rising and falling with every new claim. The Whitmores withdrew from public view, yet their mansion became a beacon for charlatans, each promising resolution, each delivering only shadows. Margaret's story, once rooted in a family tragedy, grew into legend, shaped less by what was known than by what was imagined. The battle between rationality and mysticism defined this chapter of her story. On one side, the detectives with their notebooks and suspicions. On the other, the mediums with their visions and candles. Between them, a grieving family and a hungry city, both desperate for answers, both doomed to disappointment. Perhaps the real tragedy of Margaret Whitmore lies here. Not only in her disappearance, but in the way her absence became a stage upon which reason and superstition fought, and both lost. And so, by the spring of 1922, the case was no closer to resolution than on the night she vanished. The detectives had exhausted their theories. The psychics had spun their visions. The press had sold its papers. Yet Margaret remained missing, her fate no clearer than before. What endured was the legend, the heiress who disappeared into silence, leaving behind a trail of contradictions. Was she a victim of crime, caught in the ruthless gears of organized smuggling? Was she a daughter, sacrificed to reputation, erased by her own family's silence? Or was she, as the mediums insisted, already beyond the veil, her body swallowed by the lake or her spirit trapped in restless wandering? Every possibility is both convincing and hollow, both rational and absurd. The truth remains hidden, but one thing is certain. Margaret's case could not be solved because it was never simply about facts. It was about faith, doubt, fear, and the human need to explain the unexplainable. And in this battle, as in so many, the mystery itself triumphed. In the aftermath of Margaret Whitmore's disappearance, the city of Chicago buzzed with rumor, speculation, and false leads. Detectives made their reports, journalists pressed their theories, and mediums whispered their visions into dim-lit parlors. Yet the family at the center of it all, the Whitmores themselves, became a study in silence. While the world leaned in, straining for an explanation, those who should have spoken most remained the quietest. Their stillness was more unsettling than any headline or séance. In fact, silence became their enduring monument, their chosen weapon, their shield, and perhaps their confession. The Whitmores were a family accustomed to scrutiny. As one of Chicago's wealthiest households, their lives had been chronicled in society pages, their galas photographed, their name attached to charitable funds and grand business ventures. Before December 1921, Margaret's life had been a matter of public record, her birthdays attended by city elites, her education noted, her every suitor dissected. But after her vanishing, her name fell into a chasm. No public statement was issued by her father, Richard Whitmore. No tearful pleas were offered by her mother, Evelyn. Not a word was spoken at public gatherings, not even in acknowledgement of grief. Invitations were sent out for parties the following year with no sign that tragedy had struck. To the outside world, the Whitmores behaved as if Margaret had never existed at all. Behind the closed gates of the estate, the silence grew thicker. Servants whispered among themselves about strange habits and omissions. One chambermaid swore that the young lady's room had been locked the morning after she vanished, and no one entered it again. Curtains drawn, windows latched, her possessions untouched, as if sealing her absence into a private tomb. Another servant, a footman who had worked in the house for decades, recalled hearing orders that Margaret's belongings were not to be moved, sold, or donated. Her clothing remained in her wardrobe, her books on the shelves, her perfume bottles gathering dust. The silence was not just in words, it was embedded in space, in locked doors, in frozen time. At family dinners, the strangeness was subtler but no less chilling. Distant cousins later remembered that Margaret's chair remained at the table, though no one sat there. It was not draped in black or formally marked as absent, as tradition might dictate, but simply left unoccupied, a void among silverware and crystal. Conversations continued as though nothing were missing, yet the presence of the chair made absence impossible to ignore. Was this an unconscious tribute, a gesture of denial, or something more ritualistic? The survivors gave no answers, but in every act of omission, the silence grew heavier. Psychologists often argue that silence is one of trauma's most common symptoms. Families confronted with sudden loss sometimes refuse to speak of the missing, as if words themselves would unravel fragile stability. Yet in folklore, silence often has a different meaning. It is the sign of a pact, an agreement with forces beyond the ordinary, whether made in fear or ambition. For the Whitmores, both explanations linger uneasily side by side. Their silence may have been born of guilt, an accident concealed, a misdeed hidden, or it may have been demanded by something darker, a price for survival and prosperity. Richard Whitmore immersed himself in business in the years following Margaret's disappearance. Records show that his investments expanded rapidly, even as the Depression loomed. He funded rail ventures, shipping companies, and real estate projects, each returning profit against all odds. Colleagues admired his focus, his refusal to be distracted by personal affairs. Yet others noted how ruthlessly he avoided mention of family. When asked about children in interviews, he would reply vaguely or pivot to another topic entirely. His silence became a habit so entrenched that even journalists stopped pressing. Evelyn, by contrast, dedicated herself to philanthropy, founding charities for orphans and widows, funding hospital wings and supporting artistic societies. In photographs she appeared composed, elegant, untouchable. But those who knew her closely remarked that she never set foot in her daughter's locked room again, though she often paused outside its door, hand resting against the handle as though listening for something within. This combination, offerward-facing activity and private silence, created an aura of unease. Outsiders began to wonder, was their silence born of grief too sharp to name, or was it the silence of concealment? Did they know what had happened to Margaret, and did their refusal to speak serve as protection against discovery? Some whispered that Margaret had died in the house that night, whether by accident or design, and that the Whitmores buried the evidence, using wealth and influence to erase traces. The sealed bedroom, the empty chair, the refusal to speak, these details fit neatly into a narrative of hidden guilt, but others leaned toward a supernatural interpretation. Folklore surrounding the family grew as quickly as the silence itself. Some claimed Margaret had been taken by forces beyond, that her disappearance was no human crime but a curse or bargain. In these tellings, the Whitmores' silence was not voluntary but enforced. Perhaps they had made a pact with powers old and unnamed, prosperity in exchange for sacrifice. In this reading, their sudden fortune in business and society was not coincidence, but consequence. Margaret's absence was the price, and silence was the clause binding them to its terms. To speak her name would be to break the pact, to call down ruin. This interpretation gained strength as neighbors reported eerie phenomena in the years after. Lights flickering in the locked bedroom when no one was present. Music boxes playing faintly through closed doors. Servants swore they heard footsteps at night, always pacing the same length of hallway where Margaret once walked. Some left their posts abruptly, unwilling to endure the silence that had turned to haunting. For them, the Whitmore mansion was not simply a house of wealth but a mausoleum of unspoken dread. And yet not all saw the family's silence as sinister. A few sympathetic observers argued that their muteness was a desperate attempt at survival. The city's press fed relentlessly on scandal, and to speak publicly of Margaret would have prolonged agony, invited scrutiny, perhaps even endangered business ventures. By retreating into silence, the Whitmores may have sought to shield themselves from the world's predations. In this view, the silence was a fortress, not a confession. But even if born of necessity, its effect was the same. Margaret disappeared not only in body, but in memory, erased from speech, consigned to an absence that grew more absolute each passing year. This erasure extended beyond the household. Family portraits that once included Margaret were later displayed with her image removed or cropped. Yearbooks and society bulletins ceased to mention her, as though editors had been quietly instructed. A few surviving letters show that extended relatives were warned not to discuss her in correspondence. The silence spread outward like ripples, turning absence into exile. It was not just that the Whitmores refused to speak, it was that they forbade others to do so as well. Silence became an inherited condition, passed through generations of hush. And yet, the chair at Thedable remained. This paradox, a public erasure, a private preservation, embodied the Whitmores' strange mourning. To the world, Margaret was gone. To the household, she was still there, though untouchable, unspoken, locked behind doors and rituals. The survivors lived in contradiction, both denying and preserving, both forgetting and remembering. Their silence was not emptiness, but a carefully constructed labyrinth in which truth could never be found. Historians who later examined the case argue that silence itself is evidence, though what it proves depends on interpretation. To criminologists, the refusal to speak suggests complicity. Top psychologists, it signals trauma too overwhelming for words. To folklorists, it marks the fulfillment of a pact. But what unites all interpretations is recognition of silence as active, not passive. The Whitmores were not merely quiet. They maintained silence as one might maintain a secret garden, pruning words, cultivating absence, ensuring that no trace of Margaret's fate escaped. If grief was their prison, they built its walls themselves. If guilt was their burden, silence was their absolution. If a pact was their anchor, muteness was therapy binding them to it. The survivors' silence, then, may be the loudest clue of all. It tells us that something within that house demanded secrecy, whether it was human error, human crime, or something far older. And so the Whitmores lived on, Richard expanding his empire, Evelyn polishing her charities, yet always against the backdrop of silence. Guests who dined in their halls felt the void pressing at the edges of conversation. Servants avoided the north wing of the house after dusk. Cousins remembered dinners where the empty chair was a constant shadow. Silence, once chosen, became tradition, then curse. Decades later, when the estate eventually fell into other hands, Margaret's room was opened for the first time. Inside, everything remained preserved in the fashion of 1921. Dresses hung in wardrobes, their fabrics fragile with time. A vanity still held powder, as though awaiting its owner's hand. The bed was neatly made, pillows undisturbed. Dust lay, thick upon every surface, yet nothing had been removed. It was a room frozen in silence, sealed by survivors who had lived the rest of their lives refusing to speak. What does such silence mean? Was it grief too heavy to name, guilt too damning to confess, or pact too dangerous to break? Perhaps it was all three. In psychology, silence signals trauma. In folklore, silence signals bargain. For the Whitmores, Silence became identity. They chose it, they lived it, they enforced it, until it swallowed not only Margaret, but themselves. Silence is not absence of sound, but presence of fear. And in the Whitmore mansion, silence was everywhere. The disappearance of Margaret Whitmore has never belonged entirely to history. Instead, it lingers as an unsolved riddle that continues to grow with every passing decade. Unlike crimes that find resolution in police files or courtrooms, Margaret's case exists in a state of perpetual suspension, where speculation replaces evidence and imagination fills the silence left by official reports. A century after her vanishing, the world has not forgotten her name. Instead, it has transformed her into a figure of folklore, the center of countless theories that range from the meticulously logical to the wildly supernatural. And in this cacophony of explanations, the truth, if it ever existed, has been buried under layers of possibility. To understand why the Whitmore mystery endures, one must step into the maze of theories that have defined it. The first, and perhaps most enduring, is the theory of organized crime. Chicago in the early 1920s was a city steeped in Prohibition-era corruption. Bootleggers, gangsters, and smugglers operated openly, their influence extending from alleys to City Hall. For many, it was unthinkable that a wealthy heiress could disappear without crossing paths with this underworld. Some investigators have suggested Margaret was kidnapped, perhaps for ransom, perhaps as leverage against her powerful family. The idea of her body hidden in Chicago's labyrinth of underground tunnels, spaces once used for smuggling whiskey and hiding fugitives, has haunted local storytellers for generations. The city beneath the city, with its forgotten basements and sealed-off passages, offered the perfect grave for someone the underworld wanted silenced. Yet no ransom note was ever delivered, and no gangster ever stepped forward to claim involvement. Organized crime thrives on reputation, and silence rarely serves its interests. Still, the absence of proof has done little to kill this theory. On the contrary, its lack of closure feeds the imagination of those who believe Chicago itself swallowed Margaret whole. Opposite to the crime-centered narrative lies the theory of self-liberation. According to this view, Margaret orchestrated her own vanishing, carefully staged as an escape from the suffocating world of wealth and expectation. Her diary entries, speaking of her life as a gilded cage, lend weight to this possibility. Supporters of this theory envision her stepping into the chauffeur-driven car not as a victim, but as an architect of her own freedom. From there, the story branches into speculation. Some claim she boarded a ship bound for Europe, living the rest of her days under a false name. Others imagine she fled westward, reinventing herself in anonymity. Historians who lean toward this theory point to gaps in travel records, discrepancies in passenger lists, and the inexplicable ease with which key evidence seemed to vanish from police files. Was her family complicit, helping her disappear quietly, to preserve their reputation? Or was she clever enough to outmaneuver both detectives and relatives, rewriting her life entirely? The allure of this theory lies in its romanticism, the idea of a woman rejecting her gilded prison to carve a destiny of her own. Yet for every rational possibility, there exists an interpretation steeped in the supernatural. One of the darker theories suggests that the Whitmore fortune was not merely a product of steel and industry, but of something far older, something whispered about in secret circles. According to these accounts, the Whitmores were bound by rituals, bargains made to secure prosperity. Margaret, in this telling, was not abducted or liberated. She was offered. Some occult investigators claim that her disappearance aligns with dates tied to lunar cycles, ancient rites, and patterns that stretch back centuries. Paranormal enthusiasts point to the strange lights reportedly seen near the Whitmore estate on the night she vanished, framing them not as coincidence, but as manifestations of ritual activity. For these believers, Margaret's fate was sealed not by criminals or her own choices, but by forces that demanded sacrifice. Historians scoff at such claims, dismissing them as sensationalism crafted to sell papers or fill ghost tours. Yet even among skeptics, the occult theory lingers. Its power lies not in evidence, but in the way it resonates with human fears. That wealth has a hidden cost, that families harbor secrets darker than poverty could ever produce. For every historian who cites forged documents or misinterpreted folklore, There exists a believer pointing to unexplainable energy readings around the old Whitmore mansion, or accounts of visitors who swear they feel a presence when they step into the gardens where Margaret once walked. The persistence of these theories reveals a deeper truth about human nature. We cannot bear the silence of an unsolved mystery. Faced with an absence of facts, we create stories that satisfy, terrify, or romanticize. Each theory surrounding Margaret's disappearance appeals to a different audience. The crime narrative feeds the true crime enthusiasts, grounding the story in the gritty reality of Chicago's underworld. The self-liberation theory appeals to dreamers, feminists, and romantics who see in Margaret a proto-modern heroine breaking free from patriarchal chains. The occult explanation satisfies horror lovers and supernatural seekers who crave something beyond the rational, something that turns history into legend. And so the debate continues, not as a scholarly argument, but as a cultural dialogue. Each generation reshapes Margaret according to its own fears and fascinations. In the 1920s, she was a cautionary tale about wealth and vice. By the 1960s, she became a symbol of rebellion, a woman who might have fled conformity. Today, in an age saturated with true crime documentaries and paranormal investigations, she is both victim and phantom, saint and sinner, fact and fiction. The endurance of her story also speaks to the way silence transforms memory. Had her case been solved, had a body been found or a confession obtained, Margaret Whitmore would likely have been forgotten, her name relegated to a footnote in Chicago's bloody history. But the absence of resolution left a void. And into that void rushed storytellers, journalists, psychics, historians, and everyday citizens, each layering their own version of the truth. Over time, Margaret ceased to be a woman and became a mirror, reflecting the obsessions of those who invoked her name. What makes the Whitmore case unique is the way fact and folklore blur so seamlessly. The police records exist, but they are fragmented, contradictory, often tampered with. Newspaper clippings survive, but they are sensationalized, biased, eager for headlines. Oral testimonies remain, but they shift with each retelling, shaped by memory and imagination. The result is a story that resists singular interpretation. For every detail that points toward mundane crime, another points toward something uncanny. For every fact that supports liberation, another whispers of ritual. The deeper one digs, the less solid the ground becomes, until the investigator is lost in a labyrinth of speculation, as trapped as Margaret herself once claimed to feel. Theories alone cannot solve the mystery, but they reveal something just as important: the collective need to explain the inexplicable. Humans are creatures of narrative, compelled to impose order on chaos. Margaret's disappearance, with its silence and contradictions, becomes unbearable without stories to soften it. And so we tell them, again and again, reshaping her into victim, rebel, or sacrifice depending on the storyteller's own desires. Perhaps the truest theory is not any single one, but the recognition that Margaret exists in the tension between them. She is both caged bird and vanished phantom, both heiress and ghost. Her disappearance cannot be owned by detectives or psychics, historians or occultists. It belongs to the imagination of those who keep speaking her name, century after century. In that sense, the greatest theory of all is that Margaret never truly disappeared. She endures, if not in body, then in story. And maybe that is the only form of immortality humanity can grant. Margaret Whitmore's disappearance is more than a story of one young heiress lost to the shadows of Chicago. It's a reflection of the city itself in 1921, a place teetering between glamour and corruption, between roaring jazz and whispered threats, between the brilliance of skyscrapers and the darkness of alleyways where secrets festered. Her vanishing exposes the tensions of that era, the fragile veneer of elite society, the underworld's silent power, and the human tendency to explain the inexplicable with either cold logic or fevered imagination. The uncertainty surrounding her fate turns every detail, every witness, every report into a double-edged fragment, equally capable of illuminating the truth or obscuring it entirely. Perhaps she fled, casting off the gilded cage of her family. Perhaps she fell victim to those who preyed upon wealth, hidden in the tunnels, streets, or dark corners of a city that could swallow a girl whole, and leave only rumors in her wake. Or, perhaps the supernatural played its part, and her disappearance was tied to forces that human eyes cannot perceive, leaving her caught between worlds, visible to none. The silence of her family is no less haunting than the streets she vanished into. Locked rooms, untouched belongings, and unspoken grief suggest a weight too great to share, a secret that cannot be named. It is in that silence that the imagination thrives, spinning theories of guilt, protection, or complicity. Meanwhile, the contradictions of witness accounts, the endless debate between detectives and charlatans, rational investigators and spiritualists, further reinforce the sense that certainty itself has fled. The more one searches for answers, the more the mystery deepens, leaving questions unanswered and possibilities endless. Margaret's story refuses closure, because it was never just about one girl. It is about the human desire to grasp what cannot be grasped, to narrate what refuses. Narrative. Perhaps the truth lies beneath Lake Michigan, frozen in time like an undiscovered secret. Perhaps it lies in forgotten letters, hidden in a dusty chest, or in the whispered confessions never spoken aloud. Perhaps, as some suggest, she never truly vanished but became an absence that became a presence, a shadow inhabiting the spaces of memory, legend, and imagination. Some believe she was merely a casualty of crime, an innocent victim swallowed by the chaos of the world. Others argue she was chosen, willingly or unwillingly, for something far more sinister, something beyond mortal comprehension. And so, after a century of debate, speculation, and fascination, we are left with nothing solid, nothing complete, only the echo of a young woman's disappearance reverberating across time, inviting us to wonder, to fear, and to imagine. And so the question remains, and it falls to you, the witness across the decades. What do you believe happened to Margaret Whitmore?